Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine for a second being just so completely consumed by your own ambition that your imagination literally turns against you.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Like your reality actually starts fracturing.
Exactly.
Wow.
You know, you are standing in a dark hallway and your mind just begins to hallucinate a dagger floating right there in the air, pointing you toward this horrific, irrevocable act.
Yeah.
You know it's not real, right? But the psychological pressure of what you're about to do is just so immense that everything starts falling apart.
Yeah. And today we are taking a deep dive into that exact moment of fracture. We're looking at the architecture of human ruin, really.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And we're doing it through this very specific, incredibly rich lens. We're exploring the works of William Shakespeare, specifically Macbeth and Julius Caesar. But, you know, we are reading them over the shoulder of one of the greatest literary critics of the 19th century, William Hazlitt.
Right. And look, the mission for this deep dive is not to give you some dusty academic literary critique. We're not here to, memorize publication dates or recite iambic pentameter.
Definitely not. No one wants that.
Right. We are acting as your guides to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and honestly, the deeply uncomfortable life applications from Hazlitt's commentary. Our goal is to uncover these timeless truths about ambition, the terrifying twists of human psychology, and the political maneuverings that still dictate so much of our lives today.
Because we really are going to look at what happens when good people convince themselves to do terrible things. And conversely, why fundamentally good, sincere people so often fail when they're actually put in charge.
Yeah, it's a lot to get into. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to understand how Hazlitt approaches these texts, we first have to look at what he calls the taxonomy of tragedy.
The taxonomy of tragedy.
Yeah. Hazlitt possessed this really remarkable ability to categorize Shakespeare's four principal tragedies, not just by plot, but by the underlying psychological engine that's driving the narrative. He argued that they are like completely different creations of the same mind, almost as if they were written by different species of thinkers.
Oh, that's fascinating. So how does he break them down?
Well, he puts Lear first for the profound intensity of passion. It's the tragedy of raw, just unbridled emotional agony.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then he categorizes Othello as the tragedy of progressive interest and powerful alternations of feeling. The slow, agonizing poison of jealousy.
Right, the slow burn. And what about Hamlet? That's probably the most famous one.
Yeah. Hamlet, he reserves for the refined development of thought and sentiment. Basically, it's the tragedy of overthinking, of paralysis by analysis.
Which is so relatable. But that leaves us with Macbeth.
Exactly. And Hazlitt categorizes Macbeth as the tragedy of the wildness of action. But we really need to define what he means by wildness here.
Right, because he doesn't mean like a fun, chaotic party.
No, not at all. He means action that has become entirely unmoored from a rational foundation. The core wisdom Hazlitt pulls from Macbeth is this terrifying portrait of the destructive force of unchecked ambition, specifically when it's paired with an overactive imagination.
And that pairing right there, that is the lethal cocktail. I mean, ambition on its own is just a drive. Imagination on its own is creativity. But when you put them together in a high-stakes environment,
it explodes.
Exactly. Hazlitt says Macbeth becomes a man driven along by the violence of his fate. He actually compares him to a vessel drifting before a storm, reeling to and fro like a drunken man, staggering under the weight of his own purposes.
Let's examine the mechanics of that vessel metaphor for a second. A ship drifting before a storm has no rudder in the water. It is entirely at the mercy of external atmospheric pressures.
Right, it's just being tossed around.
Yeah. Hazlitt is pointing out that Macbeth's energy doesn't come from a calm, centered, masterful execution of a strategic plan. His energy springs entirely from his anxiety and the agitation of his mind.
Oh, wow. So the imagination acts as this psychological accelerant.
Exactly. An imaginative person doesn't just desire the crown. They vividly hallucinate the steps required to get it, the blood on their hands, the people whispering about them, the threats coming to take it away. They suffer the consequences of the action before they even commit it.
And that hallucination creates this massive feedback loop of panic. So Macbeth is just blindly rushing forward because he's terrified of his own thoughts.
He has to keep acting, keep killing, keep moving, just to stay ahead of the mental storm he created in his own brain.
Man, that's heavy. And this leads directly into what Hazlitt identifies as the principle of fierce extremes, right? Hazlitt observes that Macbeth as a text and as a psychological state is built entirely on violent contrast.
Yeah, the lights and shades are laid on with a determined hand. Hazlitt points out that the transitions from triumph to despair, from the height of terror to the repose of death, they're sudden and startling.
Right, there is no gentle slope, you just fall off a cliff.
Exactly. The text highlights that incredibly famous line, "So fair and foul a day I have not seen," and later, "Such welcome and unwelcome news together."
Yeah, Hazlitt says the thoughts pitch and jostle against each other as in the dark. And I really want to pause on that phrase, pitch and jostle in the dark, because think about how a modern crisis feels. When you are going through a severe personal trauma, or, when you're navigating a massive failure in your career, it rarely feels like a linear, logical progression of bad events.
Oh, absolutely not. It feels like profound cognitive dissonance. The ground literally rocks under your feet.
Exactly. The good memories and the terrifying realities are just all smashed together. Your mind can't settle on a single narrative, so contradictory thoughts literally pitch and jostle against each other in the dark of your own mind. You are experiencing the fair and the foul simultaneously.
And the underlying mechanism Hazlitt is exposing here is what happens to the human psyche when we deliberately abandon our moral compass.
Oh, that's a crucial point.
Right. When Macbeth impatiently tears aside the veil of the future, when he decides he just cannot wait for things to unfold naturally and instead forces his destiny with an impious and bloody hand, he loses his footing entirely.
Life just evolves into this unruly chaos of opposite natures trying to destroy each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you remove the center, there is no middle ground left. Yeah. There are only violent beginnings and violent ends.
It is the tragedy of a man who willingly amputates his own conscience and then bleeds to death from the wound.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
But Hazlitt doesn't stop with the corrupted soul. He pivots to a completely different, perhaps even more frustrating kind of tragedy when he looks at Julius Caesar. Because if Macbeth is the tragedy of a bad man losing control, Brutus is the tragedy of good intentions.
Yeah, and Hazlitt argues that Brutus fails precisely because he is a good man.
Which is just an incredibly difficult concept for us to swallow. I mean, we are conditioned to believe that goodness is armor, that if your intentions are pure, the universe will reward your noble stance with victory.
But Hazlitt rips that illusion away entirely. He points out that the entire design to liberate Rome fails specifically because of the generous temper and overweening confidence of Brutus in the goodness of their cause.
The mechanics of that failure are so fascinating to me. Brutus possesses humanity and sincerity. Those are the exact traits that dispose a person to recognize and resist tyranny.
Right, but ironically, those exact same traits render him utterly unfit to cope with the cunning of bad actors.
Let's break down why sincerity functions as a blinder, though. Because Brutus trusts others because he is inherently trustworthy, right?
Yes, he projects his own moral framework onto his enemies. He assumes that because he wants to secure the public good with the least possible hurt, his adversaries, like Mark Antony, must also have some foundational respect for the rules of engagement, for honor, for the Republic.
It's a fatal lack of imagination. If Macbeth has too much imagination and hallucinates threats, Brutus has zero imagination for evil.
Zero.
He just cannot conceive of a person who is purely self-serving, someone who will lie without hesitation, who will use a funeral speech to incite a riot and burn the city to the ground.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Hazlitt is teaching us a devastating lesson about leadership here. Noble intentions, absent practical, cautious realism are just a recipe for structural collapse.
Wow, yeah.
The Friends of Liberty fall prey to their own security. They mean well themselves, so they just assume others mean well. And the bad actors, the ones who stick at nothing to accomplish their unprincipled ends, they recognize that noble blindness and they weaponize it. They use Brutus's honor as the very rope to hang him.
So we really have these two completely different mirrors held up to human failure. On one side, the wild imaginative chaos of corrupted ambition in Scotland. On the other, the blinding, naive idealism in the Roman Senate.
Exactly. Two sides of the same tragic coin.
But before we pull these mirrors completely into our modern lives, we need to understand the cultural and historical lens Hazlitt is using. Because we are playing a massive game of temporal telephone here.
Oh, for sure.
We are sitting in the 21st century, reading a 19th century critic who is analyzing a 16th century playwright, who is dramatizing events from ancient Rome and medieval Scotland.
And yet, through all those layers of distortion, the core human problem remains fiercely consistent. Hazlitt is dissecting a time of barbarous nations in Macbeth, where self-interest, blood feuds, and family aggrandizement just overrode any semblance of common compassion.
Right.
And then he's contrasting that with the highly sophisticated, incredibly volatile political factions of Rome and Julius Caesar. He looks at the jealousies, the heartburnings, the angry tribunes, yelling at the commoners for changing their loyalties with the wind.
It's all so familiar.
It is. He is proving that whether you are wearing a fur pelt in the Highlands or a toga in the Forum, human psychology just does not evolve.
Hazlitt also goes out of his way to prove that these plays weren't just dusty texts read in quiet libraries, right? They were vital, active political tools. He brings in the theatrical world of the 18th and 19th centuries to show how alive these themes were.
Yeah, he notes that the Earl of Halifax specifically pitched Julius Caesar to be brought out in a splendid manner by subscription in 1707 alongside plays by Fletcher and Dryden.
But we have to understand why a nobleman in 1707 would even care about a play from 1599 about an assassination in 44 BC.
Right, well, theater was the mass media of the day. It was the public square. Hazlitt notes there were specific political reasons for that selection.
The Whig party politics of the early 18th century, right? The debates over monarchy, tyranny, and parliamentary power.
Exactly. These issues were being debated vicariously on the stage through the mouths of Brutus and Cassius.
So Shakespeare was literally being used as a rhetorical weapon. And it wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply visceral. Hazlitt writes about this with such awe when he describes seeing Mrs. Siddons perform the role of Lady Macbeth.
Oh, his description is chilling. He doesn't just say she was a good actress. He says she was something above nature.
Right. He writes that she glided on and off the stage like an apparition. In the famous sleepwalking scene, he notes that her eyes were open, but their sense was shut.
He says power was seated on her brow. Passion emanated from her breast as from a shrine. She didn't just play a character. She was tragedy personified.
Hazlitt says that seeing her in that character was an event in everyone's life, never to be forgotten. And why does this matter for us? Why spend time on a 19th century theater review?
Because it forces us to realize that these characters were designed to be experienced as preternatural events. They have the absolute truth and identity of real humans.
Exactly. When Mrs. Siddons walked on stage, the audience wasn't thinking about 11th century Scotland. They were feeling the sheer terrifying weight of guilt and ambition in the room with them.
And that brings us directly to how we translate this into our 21st century realities. Let's look at the psychology of the modern Macbeth. Hazlitt offers a brilliant comparative insight here to highlight Macbeth's specific kind of corruption. He compares Macbeth to another famous Shakespearean villain, Richard III.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you put a lesser writer in charge, two kings who murder their way to the throne would just be repetitions of the exact same trope.
Right, just a copy-paste villain.
Exactly. But Hazlitt points out they are constitutionally inverted. Richard III is fundamentally biologically cruel. He is what we would call a clinical sociopath.
Yeah, Hazlitt says Richard needs no prompter. He wades through crimes from the ungovernable violence of his temper. To Richard, shedding blood is just a pastime. He has no mixture of common humanity. He famously declares he is himself alone.
He is a predator operating exactly as nature designed him. But Macbeth is profoundly different. Hazlitt reminds us that at the beginning of the play, Macbeth is full of the milk of human kindness.
Yes, he is frank, sociable, generous. He is highly capable of pity. He is a respected general with friends and a functional marriage.
He is a fundamentally relatable, good person who is gradually, agonizingly corrupted by external pressures.
Corrupted by what the text calls golden opportunities. It's the instigations of his wife, the sudden availability of power, and the prophetic warnings that convince him he is destined for more.
And this is the translation that should terrify us, because we rarely encounter a true Richard III in our daily lives, but we encounter Macbeths all the time.
We might be Macbeths. I mean, think about the modern professional landscape. How often are fundamentally good, ethical people pushed into taking unethical shortcuts?
It rarely starts with a massive, bloody betrayal. It starts with a golden opportunity, a chance to inflate the quarterly numbers just a little bit, a chance to take credit for a colleague's work because the promotion is right there.
It is the external pressure, the anxiety to succeed, the whisper in your ear that you deserve the top spot that begins the corruption.
And what Hazlitt captures so perfectly is the psychological toll that follows that compromise. Because Macbeth isn't a sociopath, his conscience survives the murder, but it survives only to torture him.
Yeah, Hazlitt points out the devastating irony that Macbeth envies the man he murdered. Macbeth says, Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Duncan is at peace. Macbeth, having gained the ultimate power, cannot sleep at all.
Wow, it is the ultimate mapping of the modern mental health toll of carrying a guilty conscience.
When you achieve your position through compromise, you become a double thrall to your passions and your evil destiny. You lose your friends, the cordial love of your followers, your good name. Your mind becomes a prison.
And how does Macbeth try to escape reflection? By committing more crimes. He tries to banish remorse for the past by meditating on future mischief.
The doom loop.
Yes, the doom loop. You make one ethical compromise, you get caught in a lie, and instead of confessing, you double down. You silence the whistleblower, you fire the auditor, you lie to the board. You have to keep adding bodies to the pile just to maintain the initial lie until your entire life is that unruly chaos we talked about earlier.
But we cannot analyze Macbeth's fall without looking at the architect of his resolve, Lady Macbeth. Hazlitt is deeply fascinated by her. He highlights her obdurate strength of will and her masculine firmness. When she sees the opportunity for their wish-for greatness, she does not flinch.
She makes a deliberate, calculated sacrifice of all other considerations. Hazlitt points to her famous invocation where she calls on the spirits to unsex me here. And I want us to really translate that language. She isn't just talking about gender.
No, she is asking the supernatural world to strip away her human biology, to fill her from crown to toe topful of direst cruelty, to stop up the access and passage to remorse. She asks them to take her milk for gall.
She is actively amputating her own soul. If we translate this into modern terms, Lady Macbeth is the patron saint of toxic hustle culture taken to its absolute lethal extreme.
That is such a good point. How often are we implicitly taught that to reach the C-suite, to build the unicorn startup, to achieve sole sovereign sway, we must suppress our empathy?
Constantly. We are told to compartmentalize, to not let personal feelings get in the way of business.
Lady Macbeth is that philosophy weaponized. She demands that no compunctious visitings of nature shake her fell purpose. She is willingly destroying her own humanity to secure a great end.
She actually mocks Macbeth for his hesitation. She tells him not to be lost so poorly in himself. She provides the ribs of steel to the sides of his intent.
And she tells him a little water clears him of the deed, which is the ultimate delusion of the hyper-ambitious. We'll do this one terrible thing, wash our hands, and go back to normal.
But as we know from her later sleepwalking, the stain never washes out.
No, it doesn't. Now, if Lady Macbeth is the danger of amputating your humanity, let's pivot back to Rome and look at the danger of keeping it. Because Hazlitt's analysis of Brutus and Cassius gives us another profoundly relevant boardroom dynamic.
Right. If Brutus is the idealistic startup founder who believes the company's mission statement will save the world, Cassius is the irritable, suspicious, highly effective chief operating officer standing right behind him.
Yeah, Hazlitt notes that Cassius was vastly better cut out for a conspirator. He wasn't fueled by pure abstract ideals. His habitual jealousy made him fear the worst that might happen. His irritability of temper sharpened his purpose.
Hazlitt explicitly argues that Cassius's mixed nature of his motives, the fact that he had personal grudges mixed in with his political philosophy, made him vastly fitter to contend with bad men.
Which is wild.
It is, and I have to challenge the implications of that. Are we saying that noble projects fundamentally require irritable, skeptical, slightly selfish people to survive? Do we actually need Cassius on our team to protect the naive idealists like Brutus?
It's a tough question.
Because modern management theory tells us to weed out the cynical, jealous people. We want team players.
It is a deeply uncomfortable reality, but yes, Hazlitt suggests you need the cynic as an organizational immune system. Think about Caesar's famous observation. He looks at Cassius and says, "Young Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous."
Caesar, who is a brilliant tyrant, recognizes a fellow predator.
Exactly. He notes that Cassius looks quite through the deeds of men. Cassius doesn't smile at polite lies. He is a great observer of hidden motives. Brutus completely lacks that penetrating, cynical sight. Brutus assumes everyone is telling the truth.
Brutus is the guy who signs the contract without having the lawyers check the fine print because he had a really good vibe from the vendor.
Yes, and it destroys the entire enterprise.
Exactly. So how do we actually apply this framework to our own lives, our careers, and our moral choices? We can pull 3 distinct practices from Hazlitt's insights.
Let's look at the first practice, which involves guarding against what the text calls preternatural solicitings.
Hazlitt notes that from the very moment Macbeth's eyes meet the witches on the heath, he is spellbound. That single meeting sways his entire destiny. He is filled with these preternatural solicitings, these external, otherworldly promises of glory that bypass his logic and go straight to his ego.
To apply this, you have to identify the weird sisters in your own life. What are the external voices, the algorithms, the obsessive metrics, or the highly competitive colleagues whispering in your ear?
What are the golden opportunities being dangled in front of you that are bypassing your conscience and goading you into actions you will later regret?
You have to practice recognizing the source of your drive. Are you moving forward from a grounded sense of purpose, or is your energy springing from the anxiety and agitation of your mind?
If you feel like a vessel drifting before a storm, reeling and staggering to achieve a goal, you are under the influence of a preternatural soliciting. You are not in control.
The second application we can call the Brutus blind spot check. This requires us to look at how we navigate conflict and collaboration.
Let's go back to Brutus's catastrophic dismissal of Mark Antony. When the conspirators are planning the assassination, Cassius, the skeptical operator, says Antony must die alongside Caesar. He correctly identifies Antony as a shrewd contriver.
But Brutus vetoes it. He waves it off, saying, he can do no more than Caesar's arm when Caesar's head is off.
And another conspirator, Trebonius, agrees with Brutus, saying of Antony, there is no fear in him, let him not die, for he will live and laugh at this hereafter. Hazlitt's commentary on this moment is brutally succinct. He writes, they were in the wrong, and Cassius was right.
The practice here is to aggressively interrogate your own assumptions about your competitors or adversaries. Are you projecting your own sincerity onto someone who is fundamentally self-serving?
When you are navigating a high-stakes conflict, you must evaluate people based on their actual behaviors, their historical incentives, and their capacity for artifice.
Do not evaluate them based on your own high-minded ideals. Do not assume they will laugh at this hereafter when they possess the motive and the power to destroy you. You must temporarily borrow the cynical eyes of Cassius.
But borrowing the cynical eyes of Cassius leads us to the third practice, which acts as a vital counterbalance. Cultivating humanity in the dark. Because despite his fatal political blindness, Brutus possesses a profound, beautiful, personal humanity that Hazlitt highlights. We cannot let the lesson of Cassius turn us into paranoid monsters.
We see this humanity on the night before the final disastrous battle at Philippi. Brutus's boy servant, Lucius, falls asleep over his instrument while playing music for him in the tent.
Brutus is facing the collapse of his world, the burden of a massive civil war, and the impending battle. But instead of waking the boy to serve him, Brutus lets him sleep.
He says, enjoy the honey-heavy dew of slumber. Thou hast no figures nor no fantasies, which busy care draws in the brains of men.
And we see it in his relationship with his wife, Portia. He has this sudden, tender burst of overwhelming love, calling her as dear to me as are the ruddy drops that visit my sad heart. Hazlitt calls this the true humanity of Brutus.
The reflection for you, especially if you carry heavy leadership burdens, is this. Even when you are navigating massive professional stresses or fending off corporate conspiracies, you must maintain these pockets of deep, empathetic humanity.
Do not let the burden of the crown turn you into Richard III, and do not let ambition prompt you to amputate your soul like Lady Macbeth.
You must preserve your tenderness for the sleeping boy and the worried spouse. It is the only thing that proves you are still human.
But maintaining that balance brings us to some massive obstacles to growth. Hazlitt presents some hard truths that are deeply uncomfortable, perhaps even deeply offensive to a modern listener. The first major obstacle is our profound discomfort with admiring evil competence.
Hazlitt writes about Lady Macbeth with genuine, unvarnished awe. He explicitly calls her a great bad woman whom we hate, but whom we fear more than we hate.
He notes that she doesn't excite our visceral loathing in the same way that Regan and Goneril do in King Lear.
Right. Why? Because she is not gratuitously cruel. She is only wicked to gain a great end.
Hazlitt actually writes this incredibly provocative line. The magnitude of her resolution almost covers the magnitude of her guilt.
That is a wild statement to make about a murderer.
It really is. He finds her commanding presence of mind, her inexorable self-will, to be sublime.
We violently resist this idea today. Our modern cultural narrative demands that bad people must be entirely incompetent, pathetic, cowardly, and unadmirable in every single metric. We want our villains to be fools.
But Hazlitt forces us to face the deeply uncomfortable truth that sheer willpower, supreme focus, and a commanding presence of mind are awe-inspiring traits. They're formidable tools, even when they are weaponized for evil.
If we refuse to recognize the high competence of bad actors because it offends our moral sensibilities, we will chronically underestimate them.
We will become Brutus, assuming Mark Antony is just a harmless party boy, right up until he burns our house down.
Which leads directly into the second, even harder truth: the bitter pill of political realism. This raises an important question because Hazlitt makes an assertion about power dynamics that will stop you in your tracks. He writes, "The vices are never so well employed as in combating one another. Tyranny and servility are to be dealt with after their own fashion."
Let me be clear, this is Hazlitt speaking from the 19th century, advocating for pure realpolitik. He is arguing that you cannot fight ruthless, unprincipled enemies with polite, procedural sincerity.
And modern culture completely rejects that. We love the ethos of when they go low, we go high. We prioritize the moral victory over the tactical victory. We want to keep our hands clean.
But Hazlitt argues that if you spare tyranny and servility, they will not thank you. They will triumph over you.
And the ultimate insult, Hazlitt notes, is that after they destroy you, they will stand over your grave and pronounce your funeral panegyric, just as Mark Antony did for Brutus.
Antony stands over the dead body of Brutus and declares, "This was the noblest Roman of them all." It is the ultimate hollow victory. Brutus kept his hands clean, he refused to act like a tyrant, and as a result, he lost the entire republic to actual tyrants.
We have to validate how deeply cynical Hazlitt's view is. It offends our desire for a just universe. But the value in Hazlitt's uncomfortable assertion is the realization that protecting the common good sometimes requires engaging in hard, messy, practical tactics that compromise our desire for personal purity.
Dealing with tyranny after its own fashion doesn't mean becoming evil, but it means dealing with the world exactly as it is, not as we wish it to be.
It's the harsh reality that idealism without teeth is just a prey mechanism.
But how do we live with these dark truths? Because even Hazlitt seems to struggle with the weight of what he's uncovering. He goes off on this fascinating, slightly naive tangent about the future of human nature. He suggests that the progress of manners and knowledge will eventually make all of these tragedies obsolete.
Yes, he has this moment of almost utopian optimism. He argues that by the force of the police and of philosophy, murders and ghosts will eventually be eradicated.
He posits a future where there will be nothing left, good or bad, to be desired or dreaded, either on the theater stage or in real life. Humanity will just be perfectly managed and philosophically calm. So what does this all mean? Was Hazlitt right? We have vast modern police forces, surveillance states, and centuries of philosophical development. Have we eradicated the wildness of action?
This is where we must exercise wisdom with discernment. Hazlitt was writing in an era characterized by an immense faith in human progress, the Enlightenment, and the power of institutions to perfect human behavior. We must kindly but firmly reject his optimism here.
The history of the 20th and 21st centuries has thoroughly disproved the idea that better policing and philosophy eradicate human tragedy.
The enduring wisdom belongs to Shakespeare's view, not Hazlitt's utopian footnote. The dark potential of the human heart, the corrupting influence of ambition, the structural vulnerabilities of goodness, these remain ever present.
They are not erased by technological or societal advancement. The barbarous times do not just exist in medieval Scotland, they live inside our own DNA.
Which perfectly sets up our final area of comparative insight. Hazlitt brings up a brilliant comparison between the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth and the witches in a play by his contemporary, Thomas Middleton. It is a profound study in distinguishing between cosmic evil and petty malice.
Hazlitt borrows this observation from Charles Lamb, and it is a masterclass in understanding the scale of malevolence. He points out that Middleton's witches are essentially low buffoons.
They're local hags you might visit for an occasional consultation. They have power over the physical world. They can blight the corn, make the cattle sick, raise petty jars, jealousies, strifes, like a thick scurf over life.
They are the embodiment of everyday annoyance and spite. But Shakespeare's witches are fundamentally different. The text calls the Weird Sisters foul anomalies.
They have no names. They have no human relations, no earthly passions. They do not care about cattle or local gossip. They originate deeds of blood and begin bad impulses in the very souls of men. They take a pure, metaphysical delight in deformity and cruelty.
If we connect this to broader human wisdom traditions, we see that across cultures, humanity has always categorized malice into these two distinct buckets.
On one side, you have the mundane, petty selfishness of everyday life, the earthly, physical level of jealousies, office politics, and petty strifes. That is Middleton's witches.
It's the toxic coworker who steals your stapler or gossips about you in the break room. It's annoying. It's a thick scurf over life, but it doesn't corrupt your soul.
But on the other side, there is a terrifying, inexplicable cosmic force of malice, a force that seems to, as Lady Macbeth says, wait on nature's mischief. This is the systemic corruption that demands you amputate your empathy to survive.
Recognizing which kind of malice you are facing, the petty annoyance or the profoundly destructive, soul-altering force, is absolutely vital for your moral survival. You cannot fight the weird sisters with HR complaints, and you shouldn't lose sleep over Middleton's hags.
We've covered immense ground today, tracking the taxonomy of tragedy, from the stormy heaths of Scotland to the marble floors of the Roman Senate.
But I want to leave you with one final lingering thought built on the text. Think about Macbeth at the very end of his journey. He has achieved everything he thought he wanted. He murdered his way to the top. He wears the crown.
But in the quiet moments before the final battle, he has this heartbreaking realization. He looks around at his life and says, "My way of life has fallen into the sear the yellow leaf."
It is the imagery of premature autumn. He has withered his own life from the inside out. He realizes that the things that should naturally accompany old age honor, genuine love, obedience, troops of loyal friends he must not look to have, he has traded them all away.
Instead, he is surrounded by mouth honor, breath, which the poor heart would fain deny and dare not. People only bow to him because they are terrified of him, not because they respect him.
It is the ultimate tragedy of isolation. And the challenge for you navigating your own life is this. In our relentless modern pursuit to secure our own sole sovereign sway, whether that looks like a coveted promotion, immense wealth, or social status, are we unwittingly trading the quiet, profound comfort of genuine human connection for a crown that will only bring us terror?
What if the ultimate tragedy isn't failing to reach the top, but reaching it, looking around the empty room and realizing you have filed away your own mind to get there?
It is a question that requires us to look long and hard at the reflections in our own mirrors before the darkness settles in.
Yeah, before it's too late.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.